All right, go ahead and have a seat, everyone. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a good lunch. So we are back on the record. We have counsel and parties present, along with our jurors. Mr. Martin was testifying before our lunch break and is back at the stand. And, sir, again, I would just remind you that even though we took a lunch break, you're still under oath. And if you want to turn on that microphone. Yep.
Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Ringel, you may resume your questioning. Do you want, I think we were still going, had a couple pictures left. Did you want to go through those?
Yes, please. Mr. Martin, before lunch, you had been testifying to your exhibit, well, your number 40 in your report states exhibit 256. Before we move on to related photos, could you just remind the jury of what we were seeing here?
Sure. In this, excuse me, I'm sorry. This photograph here, well, let's start with the red. The red, I placed this rectangle indicating the right foot. We can see the big toe as we move across. So we have a right foot impression here. This is the door. So essentially this right foot, so right would be here, of course the left would be to the left here, and they're towards the door itself. Door hinges on this side, door hinges on this side, and they're facing this way. Points of reference for the blue, right here, this is one of our footwear impressions. This area here, if you notice, this is the edge of the footwear. Notice up here, here's the edge of the footwear, so in the closer photos, when we look at the green and the blue independently, you can see how they correspond to the edge of the shoe. Then you see that diamond pattern as the outsole of the shoe.
States exhibit 257 marked as 41 in your report.
So, look, again, going back, red, we have the barefoot impression. Now, if we look here, here's that edge. So that's the outside edge, and I can't tell you if that's a right or left. There's not a sufficient amount of information here to tell you whether it appears to be somewhere maybe in the ball of the foot area, certainly not the toe, but based upon training and experience, I would say somewhere along the mid portion of the shoe. I don't know if it's the outboard side or the inboard side, edge of the shoe here, but you can actually see the diamond pattern here as it's coming off this area here. Likewise, Your Honor, may I stand up for a minute?
You may.
Thank you. So if we look here, there's that edge of the footwear here, the shoe, footwear, and then we can actually see those small little diamonds here. Again, they're stretching or they're going across in their position in this fashion here. So here's the door and it's open. I can't tell you whether it's going in or out. All I can tell you is there's at least one footwear impression here and a second footwear impression here. So here, this is the edge of the door, or this is the bottom of the photograph. That's why I had to stop here. Now that we've actually, or I've enlarged the photograph, edge of the shoe here, notice how we have that diamond pattern. We have the diamond pattern, and it actually extends right to this edge here. So there's somewhat of a where this is blood contaminating that edge of the shoe. And if we jump up here, we'll see it in the next photo, but there's that edge of the shoe, and there's that diamond pattern. It actually extends across the barefoot impression as well.
And that barefoot impression is visible in that photograph as well?
Yes, sir. Again, I'm just trying to, in this case, depict this is one of the footwear, and there's that barefoot impression, which was in rectangular in red.
And then the final photograph here, your 43 states exhibit 259.
Right, so here we have that edge of the shoe like we have here. It appears that this has a little more blood on it, okay? But we can see the diamond as it extends out, diamond, diamond. Here's that diamond pattern going across the actual footprint. I can't tell you which one came first, the footprint or the footwear impression, but obviously one does cover the other, but again, we can't tell which one. So again, footwear here, and bloody footprint in this area.
Thank you. That's the end of the photos that you had included in your report. Based on all the information that you reviewed, including the photographs that we just went through, sounds like body cam and a decent amount of other information, were you able to reach some conclusions in this case?
Yes, sir.
What were those conclusions that you noted in your report?
Again, that Mr. Cooper was seated in the recliner, with the recliner being back, and I don't know if that was the extreme back position, but certainly it was reclined to some extent when he was shot and did not move, and when I'm saying move, get up from that position once he was shot. At some particular point after he was shot, whether it was after the first or the second shot or in between shots, he was off to his left to have created that, and I do this because I'm dripping, but that drip pattern which we see, which radiates around from the recliner, and we could see in every direction. Likewise, at some point, Mr. Cooper is repositioned or up in this fashion here up against the back, and as I sit straight up against the back of the chair, where he continues to bleed, and as he's bleeding, you get the amassing of the blood, which creates the clots on the shoulder. Likewise, corresponding clots on the quilt or the blanket behind him. And as he's in this position, you also get that, you know, I'm doing this as if it's dripping, but we can't tell. And as I mentioned before, the rate of flow, certainly when you first incur an injury, is going to be faster, because as I begin to lose blood and my blood pressure begins to decline, certainly it's going to slow down. But the blood does end up going between the arm of the chair, as I put my left arm here, is it's going between, and you get that pool at the base of the chair, the recliner. And as we look at the other thing while he's in the recliner, his arm, because one of the things we wanted to check on is whether his arm could have been the conduit. In other words, did the blood flow down his arm to create that pattern? We didn't see that. His arm is inside of the chair, and there's no evidence of blood on his arm, nor even on his stomach. The blood saturation comes down to just below the breast line here on his shirt. So again, nothing on his stomach, because that's the closest, right, to the source that would indicate him being up in the chair other than reclining. Nothing there. All of the blood stains that we have, and I'm talking about the floor now, let's just focus on the floor. We have that drip pattern, and we have the various, whether it be the footwear impressions or whether it be those barefoot impressions. Obviously, the floor had to have been contaminated with blood to have picked up the blood on the bottom of the outsole of the shoe. And the only two outsole impressions we see are by the door, so those impressions had to have been made after some amount of blood, and I can't tell you how much, had amassed on the floor. Likewise, we don't see evidence of where the original foot, how should I say, contamination came from, because again, as that pool builds up, it covers it over, so we don't know. Same thing with the barefoot impression. We have two different directions of the barefoot. We have the barefoot impression that starts at the left, sitting in the chair would be the left front. The impression barefoot going towards across the rug, although I don't have any photos of that. That was in the report. And then those other two footwear going, footprints going to the sewing room. And then we have that lone single footprint, right footprint, that we see at the door. Again, no indication of the going out the door as we see with that footwear impression that's on that cross member, which is similar, but we don't see any evidence of that footprint going out the door, because again, if it's bloody and it comes in contact, and granted it's a rough surface, so I'm certainly not going to get a good transfer of that as I would on this piece of paper here, but certainly there's nothing that indicates that other than going to the door. The door, position of the door we know had to be closed at some point during that drip pattern, because we have that drip stain on that vertical, that lower portion of the door, where the door has to be closed. That drip stain, as it's hitting, you're getting it on that lower portion of the door. At some point, the door is opened. Now, if you look at the, what I just say, that was a right foot, right barefoot. We know that the door had to be open. And remember, that door was opened by investigators. That's not how it was found. It was found closed. So the door certainly had to be opened beyond that, because it's a right foot. And someone standing facing out certainly has to have the door open further than it was in the photographs. But again, there's no evidence of where the footprint was or where those, the outsole of the footwear picked up the blood to leave those impressions. And the spatter, we have some spatter on the wall up by that light switch I talked about before, although I'm unsure, again, the height of that, but certainly that's not consistent with that drip pattern, because as we look across the room, even below that light switch on the wall, if you notice, and I say frequency, so I could just use synonymous or the same thing, number of stains, all of those stains are very close to the floor, because that's getting out to that extreme. So in order to have that spatter up high, by the switch as we do, that's something else. That's not that drip stain. So of what do we have that could create that? Do we have any type of beating that occurred? We don't see anything here that would create that. The only thing that we have, or the only possibility, is that second shot, as I talked about before, could have created some of that back spatter that would have hit. And remember, the other thing that goes along with it is we have those smaller stains. That high energy would create those, small stains. The other thing that we need to consider as well, remember, we have to look at the entirety of the scene, so we have to look at everything. One of the things that I did notice, and maybe I didn't mention it, is that in reviewing the video of the first officer, there were several first responders to the scene, whether they were EMS, fire department, representatives of the coroner's office, a medical examiner. I'm not sure what system you have, but at times they went over to Mr. Cooper, and not only did they assess him, but they also moved him slightly. And going along with the fact that I mentioned, other than the pool being dry, now, if first responders, as they're at the scene, stepping over to Mr. Cooper, assessing, one would think if the floor, that spatter, was still wet and they stepped on it, we would have some evidence, which I do see it seems when someone goes over EMS. If the blood were still wet, then we would see evidence of that. But again, there's no evidence of footwear impressions belonging to first responders. So that supports the fact that that blood, when first responders were there, was already dry at the time. Then we start to take a look at the clots, which essentially clotting is really the drying mechanism. It's just the opportunity of the solids in the blood, okay, the red cells and white cells and platelets to pull themselves together where the serum separates. It's all the process of drying, but again, the only area that was wet, at least in the photos that I looked at, was that area where, and we know that he was purging, he was losing blood, because even when he was taken off the recliner, we have the clots, he was placed on the sheet, and on the sheet, which was a clean sheet, he continued to bleed out or purge onto the sheet. So again, one would anticipate that that pool at the base of the recliner, the corner of the recliner, would be wet, but given the fact that whether it be on the arm of the recliner, on the floor, everything else is dry along with the clots, there is a passage of time that has gone on prior to first responders getting there. But as I mentioned before, you cannot, I can't tell you it was 5 minutes and 20 seconds or 20 minutes or whatever. That is dependent upon, it's just like anything else. If you were to have a liquid or something in your home, how long does it take for it to dry? Without knowing the prevailing factors there, you know, what the temperature was, what the humidity was, you certainly can't come up with a time, but you do know there was a sufficient amount of time for that to have, those areas to have dried.
Counsel, you want to approach quickly?
Gone through generally the conclusions that you reached in this case. I want to break this down just a little bit, make sure that I fully understand. First and foremost, can you talk about the position of the door during the time of the shooting?
So, again, the door, excuse me, I'm sorry. At some point, as we know, well, first of all, the first officer on the scene, the door is closed. But we do know the door is closed because we have some spatter on the door which corroborates the fact that it was closed, at least during that drip pattern that was created on the adjoining wall. Likewise, we have that spatter on the edge of the door, and if you remember the shape of the stain, that was circular. So in other words, that edge of the door is literally facing the spatter as it comes up and hits. And as I mentioned before and showed you in the video, when something comes straight on, it's going to hit at that circular, or leave you that circular impression. And again, here we have, and you saw in the video when we had the creation of that satellite spatter, is that satellite's created, granted some's going to come straight on. Likewise, some is just off to the side, as we have in this case, where it skids along the side of the door, and we get those elongated stains, which confirms, or at least like this on the outside, in that elliptical going off to the side, confirms that this as well tells me that the door was open at some position facing that, if you want to call it that parent stain, as that dripping was going on. Not only that, but in the reports of that I reviewed of the responding officers processing the scene, there was literally spatter on that door pump of the storm door. So again, let's go independent. Let's disregard the door.
Your Honor, I'm objecting as this is non-responsive and carrying on.
Yeah, again, long narrative answers. I'd prefer if we went more of a question answer, shorter answer format. So.
Thank you, Judge.
So sustained.
The question that I had for you was the position of the door. I'm going to ask you specifically, and I believe you had testified to this earlier, but the position of the door at the time of the second shot, was it open or was it closed?
It was closed because we have some spatter at the top of the door.
And then I think you were just testifying to the fact that at some point then that door was opened, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that would be following the shooting and after there was sufficient time for that blood pool with satellite stains to have formed and for those satellite stains to hit the door, correct?
Yes.
You had stated that when you reviewed video in this case and the body cam footage as well, that the first responders had slightly moved Mr. Cooper's body. Would that account for the blood pool and the satellite stains that were observed?
No, sir. He was up on the chair.
And he remained in that position even after the intervention by first responders, as you had just referenced?
Yes, sir.
So I had asked you, Judge, if we could put on the overhead, please. I'm showing you again what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 232. That's your report number 16. I had asked you if if Karina Cooper was making contact with Ryan Cooper's face. You had indicated that you believed that she was. I had asked you if you could tell from reviewing that video whether she was making contact with the left side or the right side of his face.
I originally testified that it was, again, because of the chair, that it was on his right side, but you can see that she's on the left side. And to clarify that the wound, the side with the two wounds. So that's the left side of his face to her left side.
So her face is making contact with the side of his face that has the two entrance wounds?
Yes, sir.
Is it possible, based on the stippling that you saw and the location or proximity of the weapon to Mr. Cooper's face, that the shooter would have had back spatter on them?
Yes, that's possible.
And back spatter, again, could be blood or tissue?
Sure, anything being projected back from that entrance wound, either entrance wound, excuse me, there were two entrance wounds.
Looking again at State's Exhibit 232, if there was blood evidence in the form of back spatter on Ms. Cooper's face or person, would that be altered by the actions that she's taking here that you described in 232?
It's possible. The blood had already dried. Sometimes it's very difficult to remove blood even if you're rubbing it.
When you say it's possible, why is it possible?
Well, it depends on the state of drying. It also depends on how well it's adhering to the skin surface. Excuse me. It depends on the mechanism. If you have a surface such as Mr. Cooper and it's wet, that may rehydrate it. From experience, I mean, even with deceased individuals, sometimes you really have to literally scrub to remove some blood stains. So it depends on the state of the staining.
But it's possible that any back spatter or blood evidence would have been altered by her rubbing her face in Mr. Cooper's blood.
It's possible, yes, sir.
Based on the evidence that you've reviewed, and in your opinion, is the footwear impression, excuse me, not the footwear impression, the footprint that we saw in the swing area of the door that you testified to consistent with someone closing the door?
It could be consistent with someone closing the door. It could be, yes, it would be closing the door because the blood's already on the foot.
And again, based on your review of the evidence, is the blood evidence at the scene consistent with someone shooting Mr. Cooper, a sufficient period of time elapsing for some blood to form? Footprints or footwear becoming contaminated with that blood and then exiting out that back door?
Yes, sir.
And when you say that a sufficient period of time would have needed to pass in order for the either footwear or footprint to become contaminated, what do you mean by that?
Again, I can't tell you what the rate of flow is because it depends on how quickly they're bleeding and the length of time, but certainly enough blood would have had to have amassed on the floor, because it has to have been on the floor, for the footwear to step in it, likewise for the bare foot to have picked up that amount of blood.
So if I understand correctly, with the information you provided and based on your analysis, the shooting occurred, the door was closed.
Yes, sir.
At some point, Mr. Cooper's body is to the left. Blood is coming from his face directly to the floor. For a significant enough period of time for both footprints and footwear impressions to have formed, and then later for that to have been covered over due to the continued dripping, correct?
Yes, sir.
The door was opened and exposed to that dripping and subsequent satellite stains.
At some period during that dripping, because again, we don't know how long that dripping went on.
And then at some point, the door was closed as well.
Correct.
And also exposed to those satellite stains.
Yes, sir. If it was still dripping, yes, sir.
And just to be clear, you stated that the bloody footprint that you observed in the door swing area, what you observed is not consistent with that footprint exiting the door, correct?
It goes up to the door, but we didn't see any evidence outside, nor did we see any of the footwear other than that cross member. But no, sir, there wasn't any.
Nothing to support that the bare foot went outside the door?
I'm sorry?
Nothing to support that the bare footprint went out the door?
Sir. No.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Judge.
Ms. Watt, cross-examination?
Thank you. Is it Mr. Martin?
Yes, sir. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. I apologize.
I understand we're trying to build a timeline here, but it sounds like any number of these things could have happened in a different order. For example, we don't know whether the footwear impression got there first or the footprint, right?
Specifically those two, but we know they came after the blood.
We know they came after blood,
Yes.
but we don't know which one got there first.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you say that there has to be some amount of time sufficient for the pool of blood to form in order to get the foot, the blood onto the shoe and the foot, right?
You're correct, yes.
What kind of time are we talking about? How much is some time?
It's impossible because, again, we don't know what the rate of flow is, and they're dependent on one another. Again, if I have some type of injury and it's slowly flowing, because we don't know originally his position or how much, because we know there's 2 shots, and we don't even know the timeline of the 2 shots. But certainly if I'm flowing at a gallon per minute versus 5 gallons per minute, if I'm at a gallon per minute, but yet I let it flow for 5 minutes, that's equal to the 5 gallons per minute at 1 minute. So again, I can't tell you, nor could anyone tell you that.
Okay. So I guess I kind of did want to get a minimum range. So, I mean, you could form a pool like this in as little as a minute or less?
I've seen a video of someone getting shot, granted with a 45, and when I'm telling you the blood streamed out faster than a garden hose, that's how quickly it comes out.
Okay. So we could get the pool sufficient to have a footprint. Like, basically, you could shoot somebody, blood streams out, and then within a minute, you're walking in and out.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I thought I heard you say that the footprint, so the bloody footprint that's near the door, do we know that the door was open when that footprint was placed there?
No, we don't know the door was open. No, ma'am.
Okay. I understand that you know that the son, Cade, he slipped in the blood, right?
That's what was reported. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so we see these like swoops because that's where he's slipping and falling?
Swipes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. But we don't see actual footprints. And is that because more blood is continuing to pool after he slipped?
Yes.
Okay.
Nor do we see any footprints leaving the scene. If he, again, you would assume that the bottoms of his feet, if they were contaminated, they would be leaving the scene as well.
Okay. So does that mean we don't think he actually slipped in the blood?
No, I haven't said that. Nor were we able to associate any of the footprints, because we certainly don't have examination quality photos to give us the size of those footprints. We're not sure what size they are or who they belong to.
Okay, so the bloody footprints that we have, we don't know if those are Cade's or not.
Correct.
Okay. And I guess were you surprised that there were no additional bloody shoe prints on the steps?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Any?
In all honesty, I called 2 other footwear examiners and talked to them about it. A couple things being the rough surface, as I mentioned before, depending on the coating of blood on the base of the shoe, because we do know there's a couple of impressions, so whatever blood was there, much of it could have been deposited. Likewise, going out the door, there were a couple of what appear to be drip stains. Could they be a little coming out of the furrow? Don't know, but when it comes to that cross member, maybe it's possible, and again, in talking with 2 other people, that being metal, and it might be iron, that blood may have reacted somewhat, or it could have been from the furrow when they stepped on it. So think about it this way, 2 ways, in that here we have this rough surface where it really doesn't leave that outsole design, or possibly, or a combination of both, when they get down to that cross member, there's some type of interaction chemically between the almost rusted or the metal there, or it's blood in the furrow when they step down. Since it's a flat medium, it may have transferred more readily.
Okay. When you watched the body cam of Fangman, were you taking note of whether you could see blood on Karina Cooper?
I think I mentioned during my testimony that of course, we only saw the back of Karina, but from what I noted in the back, or I believe I testified to, I didn't see any on her person. I didn't really notice any on her clothing either.
And I mean, you can see her legs. She's wearing shorts.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and you didn't, so you don't see, at least in the video, any blood that's all over her legs?
No, not at all.
Are you able to tell by your looking into this case, are you able to tell where the shooter was standing?
Well, the shooter had to be, now you have to go back to the autopsy reports, and you have to look at the bullet path. We have one in the lateral here, one in the medial here, which is more on the front, but they're pretty much slightly upward angle, if I recall, and I can pull the autopsy report, but obviously the barrel, because a shooter can be anywhere, if you think about it, right? And in some firearms, for example, if I have an automatic, I certainly have to hold it properly or it may jam. But for the most part, at least the barrel of the gun is facing this way here with a slight upward and this way here. So that would put them in a position somewhere to Mr. Cooper's left side.
Okay. I was just wondering if there's ever a situation where there's like a body print left in the pattern of the blood spray.
I've actually had a case like that, but that's extremely rare because you'd have to have a tremendous amount of back spatter. Even with a .22, the only possible, or what you're looking at here is the fact that there is a second shot where it creates that pool. So that's where that possibly would come from.
Okay, I understand. And you said that sometimes you go to the scene. Did you visit this scene?
No, I didn't, ma'am. No, ma'am.
When were you contacted to evaluate this case?
Just give me 1 minute, please, if you wouldn't mind. May I, Your Honor, just a minute?
Go ahead.
March 20th of 2024.
Okay. We're also saying that the blood is drying or dry, but am I correct? We can't time that either. That's a broad range.
Oh, it is a broad range. Extremely broad, because the humidity makes a big difference. The temperature in the house makes a difference. In this case, the porosity of the floor, there are just, not only that, but if the person is taking blood thinners, for example, warfarin or Coumadin or whatever, that's going to push out the clotting time. Likewise, there's been some articles written, if you mix blood with saliva, that actually shortens the actual clotting time. So there are a lot of factors in there. That's why, again, the time that I talked about, that 3 to 15, that Lee White study, that was clinical in a hospital under conditions as to when someone with, in this case here, they're looking at the clotting as far as venom, anti-venom, how long it would take for the average person to clot. So that's not and I did bring it up, that's not a crime scene, which there are so many other factors to consider.
Okay. And we've heard some testimony about people who were hunters and that they observed that the blood was drying. Would a person bleeding out like this inside of a home, would it be the same as a deer shot in the woods?
If the deer were inside my house or this house, no, literally, because again, we're talking about a whole different scenario. Just a breeze. One of the things that I always look for, is there a ceiling fan going? Is there a fan on a shelf going? Look at the time of year. Because just that simple fan going across the surface, and I think I mentioned to you before, just a slight depression in the flooring, that certainly can affect the drying time.
So are you able to time for us at all whether Ryan Cooper was leaned over for 5 minutes or 30 minutes?
I can't tell you that.
You've described that Ryan had to be in a particular position in this chair in order to get the blood pool that we have. Can you just show us, like with your body, can you show us how he would have been sitting in the recliner to make that pool, the first pool?
Oh, again, what we need is from the entrance site. So we know the entrance site is on the left side here in that medial area and the lateral area. He has to be over the arm of the chair, because we need a distance for that drop, as we noticed in the video, for that drop to drop down and hit that pool. So whether he's 12 inches over, he could have actually moved as well. We have, not only do we have voluntary, but we have involuntary movement, plus we could have outside movement by someone. But what we have to do is we have to have a clear path between the wound site, in this case, and the actual floor itself. So to put him anywhere above the arm of the chair, because we know he's at that arm of the chair where it's going into the chair to create the pool in the back. But again, you need that space between the floor and the wound or that blood source, and we know it's not going down his arm. So the only other possibility to amass that much blood is if he's leaning over. And again, it could have moved slightly. Could have been 12 inches, could have been 13, could have been, but again, you can see it radiating out.
And again, we don't know how long he would have had to be in that position to make that pool.
Not at all. Nope, don't know.
I do not have any other questions. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ringel, redirect.
Judge, could we just, well, first of all, we've heard a timeline in this case from Karina Cooper that she heard a noise. She got up, she briefly looked into the living room where Ryan was located, then she went to the kitchen, she looked out the window, didn't see anything, and then came back to the living room, turned on a lamp, and discovered her husband covered in blood. She also told law enforcement that she saw chunks or clots of blood. Based on that timeline, could those chunks or clots of blood have formed as quickly as outlined by Ms. Cooper?
Highly unlikely.
If I understand the study that you referenced, the Lee and White study, minimum time of 3 minutes?
Yeah, they talk about 3 minutes, yes, sir, up to 15. And again, and that's clinical. It can certainly be quicker or certainly be pushed out depending on the conditions that you're in.
And certainly you indicated that some significant period of time would have to pass from the time of the shooting to the time that the individual who created the footwear impression exited, if he did exit that back door, correct?
Yes.
And if I could display Exhibit 256, Your Honor. If I understand correctly from your testimony, this footprint that we see here, you can see it there, this would have been formed from blood that was then essentially prior to the blood filling in the blood pool that created the satellite stains, correct?
Yes, sir.
In other words, when this footprint was formed, Ryan Cooper's body was still shifted to the left and dripping downward into that blood pool?
Yes, sir.
And that was before it was then returned to its upright position, however that happened?
Yes, sir.
No further questions.
Ms. Watt?
You just testified that there had to be a significant amount of time to pass in order for the footprint to be made by the shoe. I thought you just said it could happen within a minute previously.
How about sufficient? Or significant? Again, depending on the rate of flow. Mm-hmm. If I'm streaming quite a bit of blood here onto the floor, it may only take seconds to amass just enough to get on the bottom of my shoe.
And you're right, it wasn't you who said significant, it was the state's question. Yeah. So it could be a short time.
Yes, again, depends on the rate of flow.
And then you said it was unlikely that she might see chunks of, I'm going to call that clotting, I guess, of Ryan's blood. How long do you think that would take then?
Again, the clotting mechanism starts to take place once the blood's leaving the body, but to start developing these clots as we see here and on the blanket, it's it's several factors, but not only that, but we've got the blood drying too. So when we look at the totality of what we have, I can't give you a time.
Okay. Well, you said it was highly unlikely that it was within that time, so I guess I'm asking why is that so highly unlikely?
Unlikely within what time?
That she could have heard a sound, done all these different steps, gone back and forth to the kitchen, looked out the window, and then turns on the lamp and sees her husband bloody.
Oh.
That couldn't have been enough time for these trunks to form? That she just,
Okay, so what we do know is he's off to his left at some point, and he's dripping, all right? We have that drip stain. He obviously has to be, so we have some amount of blood, some passage of time. Now he has to be placed back up against the chair, so we know that we've had a sufficient amount of time here to amass that, what's on the floor for potentially footwear, but we've also had enough time for that blood to collect on the, not only on the left side, but on the right side of his shirt as well.
okay. So then she could have seen the chunks or not?
No, she absolutely could have seen the chunks if it's time had passed where not only do you get the volume, but you get the clotting mechanism going on, or beginning,
Okay,
or progressing.
all right. So bottom line is, it depends.
No, it really does, unless you replicate the conditions.
Okay. No other questions? Thank you.
Mr. Ringel?
Briefly. So if she could have seen the clots, if sufficient time had passed, sufficient time both for the parent pool and satellite stains caused by Ryan Cooper's body being leaned over to his left, and for his body to have then returned to an upright position, continued to bleed, and the clots formed in that position.
Right.
No further questions? No.
No. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, sir. You may step down.
Thank you.
You're excused. Kodiaga, I see you with your mic on, so I'm assuming you're up. So does the state have another witness to call?
We do.
Okay.
The state calls Steve Tvadik.
All right. And while the next witness is coming in, if anybody wants to stand and stretch, feel free. Come on. Oh, here. Let me grab that chair. All right, sir, I'll have you come on up here. Everybody wants to grab a seat. You want to grab a seat to my far left over there, sir? I'll swear you in when you're seated. Go ahead and have a seat. You can move that microphone however you'd like. All right, sir, I'm going to swear you in. If you please raise your right hand. Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving today will be the truth?
I do.
Okay. And for the record, can you please give us your first name and your last name and spell them?
My name is Steve Tverdik. That's spelled Tvrdik.
All right, Mr. Kodiaga.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Mr. Tvadik.
Good afternoon.
Did I say your name correctly?
You did.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You've stated your name. What do you do for a living?
I'm a criminalist in the impression section of the DCI Crime Lab in Ankeny, Iowa.
Okay. And can you just tell the jury what that means, what you've told them you are?
So the impression section handles evidence submitted to the DCI laboratory, specifically looking for latent prints, so that's fingerprints, palm prints, also looking for footwear impressions and tire impressions. We are tasked with developing any latent impressions. Latent is simply a word that means hidden. Sometimes you look at an item of evidence and it may not, to the naked eye, have anything on it, but through a variety of processing techniques, we would then develop those impressions on that item of evidence. We also would preserve that impression, typically through photography, and then make comparisons of the questioned impressions that we found on items of evidence with known standards collected in a controlled setting.
Thank you. Now, in order to do this job, what kind of training or qualifications do you possess?
So I began in 2013, the last week of August in 2013, and at that time, I started a 2-year full-time training program at the laboratory, which involved me being trained by criminalists, trained to competency at the laboratory, being sent out to other facilities around the country to receive training by them. So I gained a knowledge of commonly used practices within the field. After the 2-year training program was completed, in the fall of 2015, I was released to do independent casework.
Have you done, in the course of your work, have you done a lot of the fingerprints, palm prints, footwear, impressions analysis as part of your duties?
I've worked a few thousand cases in my time at the laboratory since being released to do independent casework.
And have you testified previously in court in your line of work?
Yes, I have.
As part of your duties, did you happen to look at some evidence and do some impressions of some evidence that brings us to this courtroom today?
Yes, I did.
And as part of that, did you also author a report which you labeled as report number 7?
There were several reports in this case. Do you mind if I refresh my memory by looking at my report number?
Please.
Yes, I did number 7. Thank you.
Okay. And as you said, there were several reports that you did in this particular case. There were lots of different items that you were in charge of, either analyzing one way or another.
That's correct.
Of relevance to your testimony today will be, as I stated, items in report number 7. What items did you receive or submitted to you for analysis?
For report number 7, I looked at item 2.1, which was a disc made from crime scene images. Also, item number 25, which was 2 doorknobs, and item 29, which was a pair of boots.
Now, when you received these, what kind of analysis were you prepared, or were you focused on doing on the item that you've identified as item number 2?
First, I would look at the images and see if there were any impressions that I felt were suitable for comparison. There were only a handful of images on this item, and I only observed one possible footwear impression. It was a very small impression, but it was there. I believe I designated that 2.1A.
Okay. And just before you talk about that item and we go deeply into it, can you just briefly tell the jury what footwear impression analysis exactly is?
So what we're looking at with footwear and tire track impressions is, while someone is, it's a chance reproduction of the outsole tread design from a shoe onto a surface. It could be mud, it could be dirt, it could be ice, it could be somebody walking around in the snow. So we would be looking at and preserving that footwear impression and comparing it with a known shoe that was submitted for comparison.
And what's the purpose of this?
So, unlike fingerprints, where from birth they have high discriminating power, shoes, when they come off the assembly line, every shoe that was made from the same mold is, for all intents and purposes, for me, relatively indistinguishable from another shoe made from the same mold. The way they become useful for distinguishing between those two shoes, in my example, coming off the same mold, is that through use, while people are walking around on them, they're acquiring little nicks and scratches and cuts. Say you step on a nail or a piece of barbed wire, or you're a runner and you're wearing off the surface of that shoe. And all of those, the randomly acquired characteristics, those little nicks, cuts, and scratches, that's what I'm using to determine whether or not an impression was made by the same shoe as a known shoe, a known impression that I'm seeing. So questioned and known, I'm comparing questioned and known. And so if you have a good question impression, something that contains a lot of detail, then if you have the good exemplars or the known shoes, then you can make a determination as to possible source.
So,
if that makes sense.
So as a forensic analyst, what you're pretty much saying is that depending on the impression, a shoe pattern or a shoe tread, the way a shoe leaves a mark, can't tell us if that shoe was present, for example, at a crime scene or something to that extent.
Yes, you can make an association or a disassociation between a question impression and a known shoe. So if you look at a impression that you found and it's one pattern and it's completely different in the known shoe, then it's easy to make a disassociation. If you look at the impression, the question impression and the known, and they share a bunch of class characteristics, then you can make a positive association.
Okay. Now, can you generally tell us how you go about, the process you go about in making your footwear impression analysis?
So first, I look at the question impression. That's always where you start. Does this impression that I'm looking at have enough detail to compare against anything and have a useful comparison? Can I come to a result? And if the answer is yes, I do see an impression on this item that has enough detail for me to make a comparison with a known, then I would go about getting the known. They're typically submitted to the laboratory by an outside agency. And I would make known exemplars. So it's as simple as, we have a variety of techniques, but it's as simple as putting the shoe onto an ink pad and then putting that onto a piece of paper and getting your known exemplars that way. You can also make fingerprint powder lifts of it. You can do scans, but regardless, you have a to scale known impression that you've captured under controlled conditions that you can compare with the scaled question impression that you're trying to compare against.
You've talked about an item that you referred to as item number 2.1.
Yes.
Permission to publish what has been admitted as State Exhibit 166.
You say 166? All right. You may. Hold on a second. I'm going to. Oh, good, that wasn't me.
So do you recognize what has been admitted as State 166 is?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
What is State 166?
This is a photograph of the impression I examined, which I marked 2.1A.
Describe the characteristics of impression 2.1A that you examined.
So obviously it's very small. I called it an impression because it's so small that I'm not seeing enough of it to conclusively say that it is a footwear impression. So that's why I say possible footwear impression in my report. But it appears to be a series of diamond shapes that it's bordered on either side by a outline, like a straight line. or some kind of border on either end.
So you made a determination that it was, to the extent it was, you didn't have enough characteristics to make a very good comparison. Fair enough?
It's a very minimal impression, and that's correct. I did not have very, very many characteristics to go on. I don't believe it's just a series of diamonds with a border on either side.
Okay. And to the extent you're able to make a determination of what it was, it would have been a footwear with some diamond patterns in it, correct?
Yes, as I said in my report, it's a possible footwear impression. That's correct.
Okay. You're given a possible shoe or some footwear in that house that will to make a comparison with, and were you able to make a determination with what you're given?
I was, item number 29 were a pair of muck boots, and I was asked to compare them with a question impression.
And what was your determination?
My determination was that item number 29 was not the source of impression 2.1a.
You also talked about fingerprint analysis, correct?
That's correct.
Can you just briefly tell the jury what that is, and again, just a small primer on what fingerprint analysis does and what you can find?
So when I mentioned before about my description of what I do, I had talked about latent prints. Again, latent is just another word that means hidden. So we, in the impression section, receive a variety of evidence that's submitted to us that we're asked to process for fingerprints or palm prints. And that's simply a chance reproduction of the friction-rich skin on your hands and on your feet onto another surface. So the opposite of latent is patent. So sometimes you just see the prints on the surface, and then you can just photograph them. But if it's a latent print, then typically what I would do is I would take that on my item of evidence. If it's a non-porous item like a piece of glass or plastic, something like that, we have a special tank for superglue processing. The superglue that we use, it's similar to what you can get in the store, but essentially what that tank does, it adds heat and humidity into the chamber, and the superglue becomes heated and airborne. And it has an affinity for the residue left over by prints. And it bonds upon the print, and then it polymerizes, bonds layer upon itself, because it has an affinity for itself. And so this item that you previously looked at where you didn't see any prints now has a series of nice white prints on it. That's just where the friction-rich skin touched it. If you can imagine, if you ever take a shower, you look at your bathroom mirror and it looks clean and pristine. There doesn't look like there are any fingerprints on there, but then you take a very hot shower and the steam will actually develop those fingerprints on the surface of your mirror, and you get out of the shower and, oh my gosh, your mirror is covered with fingerprints. That's very similar to what this technique is, although with the superglue, it bonds to the surface. So it also has the benefit of making these prints a lot more durable. And then typically, again, for non-porous items of evidence, I would use a chemical dye stain that fluoresces to coat over the item so that they fluoresce under an alternate light source, and it makes photography easier. And yes, that's, in a nutshell, that's what I do for non-porous items of evidence that are submitted to the lab.
In your line of work, do you always find fingerprints at crime scene?
Well, I don't go to the crime scene, but on the items that are submitted to me, no, we do not.
So it's a misconception that if someone holds something, there's always going to be suitable fingerprints to be developed.
Absolutely. It's just a chance reproduction of the friction-rich skin on your hands or feet onto a surface. So chance means sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not.
Was there an item that you identified as item 25 that you were tasked with looking for suitable prints?
Yes.
What was item number 25?
They were doorknobs.
Did you therefore try to find prints on the doorknobs that you've talked about?
Yes, I did.
Were you able to get any prints on those doorknobs?
I was able to see ridge areas, but there was nothing suitable for any kind of comparison.
So, and I'd asked whether you can always find prints on something that someone has touched. What are some of the reasons why you cannot, sometimes you don't find the prints?
Well, that I don't find the prints, or that I don't find suitable prints?
That you don't find suitable prints.
Okay. A number of reasons. One is if it's a item that's used over and over and over again, you can have a series of multiple overlapping prints. For those of you who are old enough to remember film cameras, if you have a double exposed image on a film camera, or just imagine multiple pictures being laid over the top of each other, you can't quite make out any of the features. That's one thing. Another thing is if something was wiped, you know, just the mechanics of touch, things are regularly being touched and swiped, and that movement can distort or obliterate prints. Prints are relatively fragile, and environmental conditions can also play a part. If you have something that's exposed to the elements outdoors, for example, that can certainly obliterate prints. If you have environmental conditions such as it being overly dry, the fingerprints are primarily moisture, so if you have a very dry environment, that can inhibit the deposition of fingerprints. There's a long list of things
So multiple factors, like the surface of what you're talking about, the surface of the thing, the texture of the surface of what you're talking about could influence that.
Texture could certainly, highly textured surface, you could just have parts of the ridges that are reproduced on the surface, which wouldn't give you a good picture of the actual detail.
Someone wore gloves, for example, will that affect it?
Yeah, certainly. If you're wearing gloves, then you have a tendency to not leave fingerprints. There are some gloves that you can perspire through and still leave fingerprints, but it certainly would be a limiting factor.
So basically, just because you don't find something on, for example, item number 25, the doorknob, doesn't mean that someone did not open that door. Fair enough?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Ms. Watt, any cross-examination?
Just a couple questions for you. So your report indicates doorknob. Were there more than one doorknob that you...
Well, so doorknobs come in two halves. There's an inside and outside of the door. So.
Okay. So it's just that you had both sides from the same door.
Yeah, I had two knobs submitted in that item.
Okay. The footwear impressions that we saw, did you ever have a chance to see any photos of footwear impressions found inside the home?
Footwear impression 2.1A was the only one I examined in this case.
So have you examined any of the photos that were enhanced by our previous witness, Mr. Ken Martin?
No, I've just, the only images that I looked at were the ones that were submitted in item 2.
Okay.
Laboratory item 2, sorry.
Do you know, well, I'm sure your answer is going to be no then, but were there ever any shoes submitted to you from Houston Danker's residence?
I'm not aware of any shoes that were submitted other than item 29, which I just spoke about.
And item 29 was a pair of kids' shoes, right?
Yes, I believe kids' muck boots, I think, was the description.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kodiaga, redirect.
I have no question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. You may step down. You're excused. State prepared to call its next witness.
The state calls Brenda Reinhardt.
Okay. afternoon, ma'am. Have you just take a seat, actually, right there, and then I'll swear you in. You can move that microphone around however you'd like.
Okay.
All right. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving in these proceedings will be the truth?
Yes.
Okay. And then for the record, can you please give me your first name and your last name and spell them?
Yes, my name is Brenda Reinhard, Brenda Reinhard.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kodiaga?
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Reinhardt, what do you do for a living?
I am a criminalist at the Iowa DCI Crime Laboratory in Ankeny.
And how long have you worked with the DCI Crime Lab?
I've worked with DCI since 2015, so about 10 years.
What do you do at the crime lab?
I work primarily in the biology DNA section of the lab, so I examine evidence that's brought into the lab, and I may, depending on the case, look for the presence of any bodily fluids that might be present, and then I will take samples of those items and attempt to obtain any DNA profiles that can then be compared to any known samples to see if they can either be included or excluded as a contributor.
Will you briefly summarize for the jury your education and your specialized training to be a DNA analyst?
Yes, so I have a bachelor's degree in biology and a bachelor's degree in forensic science from Columbia College in Missouri, and I have a master's degree in forensic science from the University of New Haven in Connecticut. Additional training that I had was after I graduated, I received the criminalist position at the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department Crime Lab in 2011. And I went through about a 9-month training under 2 court-qualified analysts. That also included numerous literature readings as well as some outside trainings that I'm required to do. And then I had to take both written and oral exams as well as a competency test to be signed off to do casework independently. And then when I received the job in Ankeny, I went through about a 3-month training under the DNA technical leader, and same tests and oral exams and a competency to be signed off. And I'm also proficiency tested by an outside agency twice a year.
As part of your duties, have you performed various DNA analyses over the years?
Yes, I have.
Does that go into hundreds?
Thousands, yeah.
Okay. Can you briefly tell this jury what DNA is and just go through the process of what DNA and what it entails?
So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the chemical blueprint that makes all of us unique as individuals, with the exception of identical twins. We receive half from our mother and half from our father, and it can be found in blood, seminal fluid, saliva, or epithelial cells, which are skin cells.
So in other words, we sometimes shed DNA when we're sitting, when we're talking, when we're touching things?
Yes.
Were you assigned to examine some items that your lab received that relate to this case that brings us to this courtroom today?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember the items that you were able to examine?
Yes, there was actually numerous items.
Okay.
If you don't mind if I refer to my report.
Yeah, with the court's permission, you can use your report to refresh your memory.
Any issue?
No.
All right, go ahead.
Did you just want me to list all of the items I examined or looked at, or?
Let's start with the first section of what you received and what you identified them as. And I'm going to ask you to just slow down so that the court reporter can catch everything you're saying. So from the first part or the first, what I'll call paragraph of your report.
Of the report, sorry, just so I clarify, of all the items submitted or the items that were examined?
Let's talk about the items what items were submitted?
Okay, sorry. The items that were submitted were, there were swabs of a stain from the sewing room floor, swabs from the living room floor, swabs from the outside landing of the living room, stains from the cement and railing on the first step up outside the living room door, swabs of stains on the exterior of the living room door, swabs of a stain from the red Ford steering wheel, swabs from the Ford truck driver's door handle, swabs of the red Ford truck steering wheel. I had a bloodstain card from Ryan Cooper, as well as left-hand fingernail clippings and right-hand fingernail clippings and pulled head hair of Ryan Cooper, as well as a t-shirt from Ryan Cooper. There was also an interior doorknob from the crime scene. There were 6 swab boxes that were collected from the door handle area, a gray t-shirt, a pair of black Old Navy shorts, and muck boots from the mudroom entry. And then I had known buccal swabs. That's like the inside swab of an individual's cheek. So known samples from Cade Cooper, Cable Cooper, Karina Cooper, and Cortland Cooper.
What is the purpose of these buccal swabs? What will you do with them?
If a DNA profile is developed from any of the items of evidence, then that profile can then be compared to any known samples brought into the lab. So then we can tell if that person is either included or maybe excluded as a contributor.
When you talk about DNA profile, what do you mean by that?
It is just a numerical representation of an individual's DNA. Like I said before, all of our DNA is unique with the exception of identical twins, and we look at 21 different unique locations on an individual's DNA.
In the line of your job, do you find there are misconceptions from the public that DNA is always found on a scene of a crime?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury why that's a misconception or why sometimes DNA is not found?
Yes, so sometimes, I guess the most DNA that we get from, the reason why we take buccal swabs, like the inside of someone's cheek, or we get a known sample from blood, for example, it's a rich source of DNA. So we should most likely get a DNA profile from those type of items, depending on how much is present. And then the other items would be touch DNA. So even if I just touched this table and I swabbed it, I may or may not find that my DNA is there. It can depend on numerous factors. So how long I touched it, if I rubbed it or had any force against it, if it was a smooth surface versus a rough surface, and depending on time, how long the DNA's been there, if it's been outside, or something like that, it can be degraded by certain factors, those kind of things.
So from your example of touching that table, does failing to find DNA from you touching that table prove that you never touched the table?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Does failing to find DNA prove that that never happened, or it just sometimes shows that there was no DNA to be found?
It just shows that there was no DNA found or not enough present for me to even compare to anyone's DNA.
Can you briefly explain how you perform your DNA analysis?
Yes, so depending on the type of case and what I'm looking for, I will screen for the presence of bodily fluids. If that's the case, I'll take a cutting or sample from that item. I will place that into a tube and then add some chemicals to break open those cells to release that DNA if there's any present. I will then quantify it to see how much DNA is there, and then I will amplify it or make millions of copies of it so that it can be read on an instrument that will give me a DNA profile. That DNA profile can then be compared to those known samples.
Were you able to develop a DNA profile, therefore, of Ryan Cooper?
Of his known bloodstain card, yes.
Okay. And you also indicated you are able to develop a DNA profile for the family members who you're given their DNA, correct?
Yes.
Now, you talked about some items that you received and that you were able to swab or were swabbed for DNA and you're able to test. Can you tell us, starting from item 8 through item 12, what examinations you performed and what was the results of those examinations?
Yes, so for items 8 through 12, no examinations were performed on the swabs at that time.
What about item number 13?
Item 13, screening did not indicate the presence of blood on the swabs of the red stain on the steering wheel, and so no DNA testing was attempted.
Can you just explain what that means? Maybe in layman terms, just break it a little down.
Yes, so the swabs I received, if they are red in color, I will screen them for the presence of blood. We use 2 color changing tests. So all I'll do is take 2 swabs, I will moisten them with water, and then I will swab the actual red stained swabs, and then I will add the chemicals, each chemical to those swabs. In the presence of blood, one will turn a bright pink color, and the other will turn like a bluish green color in the presence of blood. If I don't get that color change, then that does not indicate the presence of blood.
So whatever looked like blood maybe turned out not to be what you thought about it being blood. Fair enough.
Yeah, there's lots of red substances that can look like blood.
Okay, so on a farm truck that's used in the farm, there could always be something that someone touched it with earlier on that looks like blood, but upon further testing, your lab was able to say it's not, there's no presence of blood in it.
Correct. We get even stuff from paint or stains on some items of clothing that look a lot like blood, or even ketchup. So.
What about, so we talked about item number, that was item number 14.
That was 13.
That was 13. What about item number 14?
Item 14, no DNA profile was developed from the swabs from the driver's door handle.
Okay. What about number 15?
The DNA profile developed from the swabs of the steering wheel indicated a mixture of at least 2 individuals. That was too weak for conclusive interpretation.
Again, can you explain that in more layman terms?
Yes, so I could tell that there were 2 individuals present on that item. However, it was just too weak, or just too little DNA there to even be compared to any known samples.
The fingernail clippings, head hair, and the T-shirt that Ryan Cooper was wearing, again, those were not tested for DNA.
Correct.
Sometimes as you test these, do you use common sense and decide some things don't need to be tested because you know what DNA will be on them? Is that why?
Sometimes that's the case on some items, or sometimes we only have, so when we're given evidence at the beginning, we do limit the number of items that are tested right off the first submission, and then they can be tested later, at a later date if needed.
There was a match that when we talk about letter items that you tested, the interior screen doorknob, did you test that?
The interior...
The doorknob, did you test the doorknob? That's item 25.
Item 25.
Yeah.
On the doorknob, I did look at the doorknob. Previously, before I looked at it, on this doorknob, excuse me, there was an LP, or latent print examination assignment, as well as a DNA assignment on that doorknob. And so I did look at it, and I decided that it was a smooth surface. And so a lot of times we do bring down the LP examiner to come and look at it with us, and sometimes we'll do both. So I'll usually take the rough surfaces, and he'll take, or the LP examiner will take these smooth surfaces. Since this was all smooth, we decided to just go with, I called the agent to see what assignment he would rather do, and they chose to do LP on that one. Excuse me.
Are you less likely to find DNA on smooth surfaces?
Sometimes, most of the time, and then on doorknobs, a lot of times we will get mixtures or too weak, because a lot of people touch doorknobs. So prints are usually a better way of getting those better results.
Did you examine what you marked as item 26?
Yes, I did.
And those are the ones we've talked about?
Yes, those are swabs from door handle, I believe. From the door handle area.
You also had a report which you labeled as report number 10.
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us the item or items you examined under the report that you labeled as report number 10?
Yes, number 10, I looked at swabs from the cement and railing on the first step up outside the living room door.
And what were you testing in this item number 10?
I screened the items for the presence of blood, and screening indicated the presence of blood on those swabs. And the DNA profile developed from those swabs matched the known DNA profile of Ryan Cooper. The probability of finding this profile in a population of unrelated individuals chosen at random would be less than 1 out of 30 decillion.
So basically what you're saying is that there's less people in the world compared to the person who matched this blood. It was Ryan Cooper's blood. Fair enough?
Yes, I believe the world population is about 8 billion. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat.
You may.
30 decillion. Yeah.
Give us a second. All right, go ahead whenever you're ready, Mr. Kodiaga.
And just to recap from what you've said, to be clear with the jury, the absence of DNA evidence does not mean that someone wasn't there or someone did not touch something. It just means that sometimes DNA evidence can be unavailable, correct?
Correct. Just for an example, I do train some new analysts that come into the lab, so we try to do some fake evidence items. So, for instance, I'll take a knife and maybe hold it in my hand for a little bit, and then I will put it into that evidence item. We'll swab it, and a lot of times we'll get a weak profile or nothing at all. So it just depends how the item is handled or if it's been wiped off. Somebody could be using gloves at the time, so without that touching that surface, there could be no DNA present because of that as well.
I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Ms. Watt, any questions?
Yes, just a couple. So you were mentioning how you had to make a decision whether to do the latent print processing or the DNA on the doorknob.
Yes.
Is that because you can't do both in the same area?
So if I did DNA on it, I would essentially take swabs of the entire item. And so that would, in essence, ruin any fingerprints that might have been left behind. And then if LP does their examination, they do some chemical processing to it that can ruin the DNA. So you kind of have to choose when it's just solely a smooth surface. But then when there's a rough surface and a smooth surface, I will take the rough areas and then leave the smooth areas for them.
Okay, and so like if you had a bigger object, you could limit, you could take half of the piece and he could take the other half. This is just small, what we have?
Absolutely. Yeah, depending on what you can do, yeah.
And this pertained to both, what I'm understanding is that there were two actual knobs. It's just both sides of the door?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
I'd have to refer to my notes on that one, but yes.
And then a quick question about the blood outside. So I understand that they took swabs of, so we saw a picture with a bunch of different stains, red stains on those stairs. So did they swab all of those stains and then submit that to you as one item, or did they just choose one?
I did not look at the crime scene photos, but normally it's of just one item. So in particular, this one does say placard 8. So I would assume that they took just a swab of that placard 8 item, whatever they would have considered placard 8.
Okay. So, but for each, obviously for each stain of blood that we see somewhere, that doesn't necessarily, just because this stain here is Ryan Cooper, that doesn't mean that the stain next to it is also Ryan Cooper.
That could be possible, yeah.
But then I also assume if they were to mix two, like if they were to take one Q-tip and swab two different stains, it wouldn't be coming back as Ryan Cooper when you're doing a DNA testing if there was a mix.
If there was a mixture of two people, one was one person, one was the other, yes, I would expect to see a mixture of two DNA, and yeah, I would see two people instead of one.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions.
I have no
Any-
questions.
All right, thank you, ma'am. You may step down.
Thank you.
You're excused. And ladies and gentlemen, rather than start another witness, we're pretty close to our midpoint for the afternoon, so we'll take a 15-minute break. And again, I'd remind you of the admonition that I gave you previously.